Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to make this colorful card to send smiles to someone. Hope you enjoy! So the finished card size will be 5 by 7 inches. And the first thing I did was I got a piece of paper which is 5 by 7 and I started working on my background. So I used some tumbled glass distress ink and I blended this on the top third of the paper. Then once I was happy with where the color is, I went onto my Salty Ocean Distress ink and put this in the middle third of the paper. Now I didn't worry too much about blending the color. When I'm using distress inks, I like to just put them down first and then go back and blend them in. So at the bottom of the card, I added some Rustic Wilderness Distress ink. And then once I was happy with where the colors are, I went in with more pressure and blended the colors together. Now I used the same 3 colors on the inside of the card, on the little rectangle in the middle, which you'll see later on in the video. But you could always use different colors on the outside of the card if you prefer. So once I was happy with my blending, and I have a nice gradient here, I used my heat tool to make sure that my background was completely dry. And it's important that you dry the distress inks before the next step. So then I used this Lavinia stencil. This is called White Orbs, and I taped it gently to the back using some post-it tape. And then using some VersaFine clear sticky ink and a blending finger dauber, I applied the ink around the whole paper. Now you don't need to worry too much about the middle of the background because the circles in the middle won't show up on the final card. So I used a little bit of pressure on the middle, but most of my emphasis was on the outside circles. Now it's important to work fairly quickly at this stage because you want the VersaFine ink to be tacky enough for the embossing powder. So now I'm just going to remove that post-it note tape and using a tub of clear embossing powder, I'm going to apply it over all of the white orbs on my background. Now once the embossing powder has covered the whole area, I'm just going to lightly tap it back into the container. And if there's any areas that really stick to the paper, I'll just use a little paintbrush to wipe them off. You can also use an anti-static bag before using the Versa ink to make sure that it doesn't stick more than it has to. So now I'm going to use my heat gun and heat all of the magic white orbs here. And I prefer to use a Ranger heat tool rather than an embossing gun because I find that the heat is gentler and there's less chance of the embossing powder flying across the room. So once this is completely melted, I can move on to the next step. And I should mention that this is regular card that I'm using today. It's not watercolor card. It's just the alcohol-friendly card that I use for card making. So now the fun bit. Once the embossing powder is cool, I'm going to apply some pixie powder over the background. And I've applied the emerald green on the bottom and the aqua lagoon on the top. And then I'm going to spray the entire panel with water, and this will activate the pixie powder and bring it to life. And once I've completely wet the pixie powder, I'm going to carefully lift up this paper and put it onto my Make Art station so that I can put it aside to dry. You could always use a chopping board or just put it on another surface to dry. So now I'm going to die cut 2 rectangles. The smallest is 3 inches and the largest is 3 3/4 inches. And then using the same 3 colors as before, I'm going to ink blend onto the smaller rectangle. Now, depending on the temperature in your craft room, it will probably take about an hour or so for your background to dry completely. You can always speed it up a little bit by heating on the back of the paper, but you need to be careful that you don't reactivate that clear embossing powder. So it's best to probably let it air dry. Now, once I'm happy with the blending on this miniature background, I can use my Lavinia stamps to add a little bit of a scene on here. So first I started with the twisted vine. This is actually 2 of the Lavinia stamps that come in a set, and this is a smaller twisted vine. And it works really well, not only for grass, but I've used it for swamp scenes as well. It looks really nice. And now I'm adding in the new Shimmery, the little cricket. And I'll just put him on the card there. And then I'm going to add 2 of the fairies from the Fairy Foragers. And I thought it would be fun to have a scene where these mini fairies were interacting with Shimmery, almost like they're sending him well wishes or giving him magic fairy dust. So I used the mini dots and just put this around the outside of the card and then underneath where the fairies are. I guess it could be pollen as well that they're sprinkling on Shimmery. So once I was happy with those mini dots, then I used one of my stencils from Lavinia, and there's 3 of these sun or moon stencils, and I'm using this smaller one. And I just put the ink, the cheerful ink, roughly over the area that the mask would cover, very lightly. So I wiped off the extra ink on my media mat, and then I put darker yellow ink around the outside of the mask. Then I just lightly added the ink to fill in that area of the sun. Now, once I was happy with that, I used my sparkle pen and just traced around the area of the sun. Now, I didn't worry if my tracing wasn't a perfect circle, but you could always trace over the mask if you wanted it to be exact. Now, I just thought it needed a bit more color, so I used the Glamorous ink and added some of the mini berries along the bottom of the panel. And then I added a bit more sparkle underneath of Shimmery there. And I'll just hold it up to the light there, and you can see the sparkle around the sun as well as under Shimmery. And then I used the same sparkle pen and just put the ink on the fairy wings and smudged it with my finger before the ink had set. And this way you can still see the gorgeous outline of the wings, but it makes them a little bit sparkly, as you can see with the light here. Now for the sentiment on this card, I used this Lawn Fawn set. It's called the Reveal Wheel Circle Sentiments. And I used the anti-static bag on a little bit of black card. And then I stamped the sentiment with my VersaFine clear inks. And this says, sending smiles to brighten your day. And then I just heat embossed that with white Wow embossing powder. And I thought it would be nice to have a nice bright sentiment for this beautiful, colorful card. And then I cut the sentiment into a rectangle once it was heat embossed. So now that the background's completely dry, you can see how beautiful it is. If you wanted to get rid of those tiny dots on the circles, you could use a a Kleenex with a little bit of water and just wipe them off. But I quite like the abstract effect that the pixie powder gives you. So I'm just going to put some foam squares onto that larger rectangle. That's the 3 3/4 inch one. And because it's going to be sticking onto heat embossed circles, I just put some white PVA glue on as well. And then I put this onto my card panel on a bit of an angle here. And then I used some white PVA glue and added my main panel. And I put this on parallel to the background of the card. And you can see how the colors in the background really bring the colors in the foreground to life. And then I used some foam squares on my sentiment, as well as a bit of glue. And I popped this up on the bottom of the card. Now, as you can see, it was worth waiting for that background panel to dry because it's just beautiful, sparkly and shimmery in real life. So now I'm going to use a 5 by 7 inch card base, and I'm going to use white PVA glue and glue my background onto the front of the card. And I'm just going to make sure that it's completely secure on the card blank. And I'm just going to push around the outside and make sure that it's glued down properly. So I decided for this card, instead of putting an inside sentiment, I would just use my little Shimmery stamp again. So I'm going to put him on the inside of the card. And in lieu of a sentiment, I'm going to add a little bit of color to my envelope. So using the same stencil as before, the white orbs stencil, I'm going to just lightly put some color on the front of the envelope. Not enough that it would distract the mail carrier, but just a little tiny bit of color to add a little bit of interest to the envelope. You could always add more color if you were handing this directly to the recipient. So now my envelope and my card are finished, and you can see that beautiful background, which will definitely bring a smile to someone's face. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it inspiring. Be sure to subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. Have a crafty day!